That night, the City Art Museum's auditorium glowed warmly under golden lights. People weren't gathered there for a famous artist, but to support a charity concert, raising scholarship funds for young music students. Classical pieces filled the air, played by string ensembles and choirs, until the announcer called out a name: Lucas Bennett, organ solo. Lucas stepped onto the stage, dressed in an old charcoal suit, shoes worn at the heels, and holding a thick music book in his arms. He was a second-year student, surviving on scholarships and working part-time every night to help his debt-ridden family. That evening, he chose to perform Debussy's Clair de Lune, not to showcase technique, but because it was the piece his father used to play every night when their family still lived in the small house that the bank had since repossessed. In the front row of the VIP section, Margaret Harrington, a 68-year-old widow and owner of a chain of high-end art galleries, sat quietly. She wore a deep blue dress, her silver brown hair neatly arranged, her posture straight, and her gaze seasoned by time. For the past 10 years since losing her husband, she had attended concerts like this as a habit, not expecting anything, simply sitting within the music and the silence of her own world. Lucas took his seat at the black electronic organ placed at the center of the stage. The spotlight softened. As the first notes played, the entire auditorium seemed to hold its breath. He closed his eyes, letting his hands glide over the keys, not rushing, not improvising, just allowing each note to flow like breath, like shattered memories gently gathered with all his heart. Margaret instinctively stopped breathing. Something in those notes reached a locked-away corner of her memory. The piece wasn't new. She had heard it hundreds of times in her life, but tonight it carried a different soul. It wasn't just sound, it was sincerity drawn from every key. Then in the quietest moment of the climax, Lucas opened his eyes. His gaze unintentionally met Margaret's. For a fleeting second, time stood still. She didn't see her late husband in him, but his eyes. There was something about them that made her feel as if she were looking at herself. At 20, yearning to live, daring to believe that music could save everything. After the applause, Lucas bowed and left the stage. He had no idea that this night would be the greatest turning point of his life. Margaret remained in her seat, unmoving, and for the first time in many years, a quiet question surfaced in her heart. If I hadn't come here tonight, I would never have known my heart could still feel. The morning after the concert, Lucas stopped by an antique bookstore on Alcott Street, searching for an old Debussy score. As he carefully flipped through the yellowed pages, a warm, low female voice spoke behind him. "You're the young man who played the organ last night, aren't you?" Lucas turned around and immediately recognized those eyes. Margaret Harrington, the woman who had sat in the front row, her posture composed, her gaze listening as if hearing through memories. He hesitated for a moment. Yes, I didn't think you'd remember." She smiled gently. "Some music isn't just meant to be remembered, it's meant to be kept." Margaret invited Lucas for tea at a small cafe behind the park. At first, he refused out of hesitation. He wasn't used to attention from people of a different social class. But Margaret didn't insist. She simply said, "If we can share a love for music, then age and status should be set aside." They sat under a vine-covered awning, listening to the raindrops tapping softly on the wooden table. They didn't talk about grand things, just classical music, performances at the conservatory, and the arrangements Lucas admired. He was intelligent, but never boastful, speaking with a quiet restraint and humility that Margaret found comforting. When the tea arrived, Margaret suddenly gazed into the distance and spoke slowly. "My husband loved Clair de Lune." Her voice was calm. "He passed away 10 years ago, on a rainy afternoon just like this." Lucas remained silent. That afternoon, I had a mild headache and asked him to go to the pharmacy nearby, just for a few painkillers, but he never came back. A truck with failed brakes took him away just a few blocks from home. She didn't cry, but her fingers lightly gripped the teacup. "I've asked myself 100 times, what if I had gone instead? What if I had waited a little longer?" Lucas didn't know how to respond, but in that moment he understood why this woman kept the world at a distance. He understood why her eyes carried a thin veil, like a pane of glass shielding a once broken heart. Margaret looked at him and spoke softly. Don't think I invited you for tea out of pity. I just haven't had anyone to truly talk to about music in a long time. Lucas nodded. And I've never had anyone to truly talk to about silence. That remark made both of them smile. From that day on, Margaret invited Lucas to her villa every weekend. Not to play music for hire nor for lessons, just to fill a house that had been quiet for far too long. On those afternoons, neither asked about the other's past, nor did they speak of the future. They simply let time pass, allowing silence to become a gentle thread that wove them together. Two souls that had spent a lifetime missing each other without ever knowing it. That afternoon, however, was unlike the others. Lucas arrived earlier than usual, carrying a handwritten score enclosed in a light brown envelope. On the cover, he had written only 3 words: "For you." Margaret greeted him on the porch, holding a tray of warm cookies. The wind swept through the back garden, carrying the scent of Earl Grey tea and the faint aroma of aged wood from the grand piano in the living room. "You composed something new?" Margaret asked as Lucas handed her the envelope. He simply nodded. "I think music can say things I don't have the courage to put into words." Margaret said nothing. She set the envelope on the table and told him, "Play it for me if you're ready." Lucas sat at the piano. He took a deep breath and placed his hands on the keys. The music began, not loud, not showy. The opening notes were slow, like footsteps on an old wooden floor, gradually rising into quiet yet deeply felt melodies, like unspoken questions, like glances that meet only to look away again. Margaret closed her eyes. When the final note lingered in the air, she didn't open them immediately. She wanted to hold on to that feeling just a little longer, the echo of a heart beating for something beyond mere companionship. Lucas stood up but didn't leave. He looked at Margaret for a long time. "I don't know what I'm doing," he murmured. "I just know that every time I leave this place, I feel like something is missing." Margaret turned to him, her gaze deep, as if ripples had just formed on an otherwise still lake. She was about to say something, but hesitated. "You know," she finally said, "whenever I hear you play in this house, it feels like he's here again. But for the first time, it doesn't hurt. It feels alive." Lucas smiled. Not the smile of a young man flirting, but the smile of someone standing in front of a truth he could no longer deny. "I'm not trying to define what this is," he said. "I just know that when I play for you, everything else disappears." For a moment, there were no years, no titles, no barriers between their worlds. There were only two people realizing that they hadn't found each other to fill a void, but to make life feel real. Then unexpectedly, Margaret stepped forward. She placed a hand on Lucas's cheek, softly, gently. No kiss, no boundary crossed. Just a touch that made both their hearts stop for a fleeting second. "You don't have to call me ma'am when you're here," she whispered. "If you want, just call me Margaret." Lucas looked at her, something bright flickering in his eyes, as if she had just handed him a key. "I will," he said, "but only if you let me play Margaret one more time." And so, in the dimming afternoon light filtering through the curtains, the piano began to sing again. This time, not just a melody, but the first confession of a heart that had never dared to love. On a Sunday afternoon, with the sun gently shining, Margaret and Lucas were trimming the roses in the backyard when a black car pulled up in front of the villa. The engine cut off, and from the vehicle emerged a tall man in a gray suit, his sharp gaze concealed behind dark sunglasses. Edward, Margaret's only son. Margaret straightened, removing her gardening gloves. Her expression stiffened, not with anger, but with surprise. "Edward," she said, almost a whisper. "I thought you were in Europe," Edward replied, his tone unreadable, neither warm nor accusatory. "Until I got an email from your secretary, Mrs. Harrington has postponed her business trip for personal reasons." His eyes shifted to Lucas, who stood by the rose bush, still holding a pair of pruning shears, looking slightly uncertain. "Hello," Edward said, his gaze unwavering. "Are you my mother's new employee?" "This is Lucas," Margaret interjected before Lucas could respond. "He's a music student. I invited him to play here each week. Play music? Edward raised an eyebrow. How convenient. This house could use some sound. Lucas gave a polite nod and excused himself, stepping inside to avoid intruding on their conversation. Once he was gone, Edward turned back to his mother. You can tell me the truth. I'm old enough to hear it. Margaret sighed, pulling off her remaining glove. Lucas is not an employee, and he's not someone I need to hide. He's simply someone I feel close to. Edward met her gaze directly. Close enough that you canceled a year-long business trip just to stay home with him? Silence hung between them like a thick curtain. Finally, Margaret spoke. There are people who come into your life only once. Her voice was calm. If you refuse to understand, I won't force you. That evening, Edward stayed for dinner. Lucas remained polite, keeping his distance. Edward said little, but his eyes quietly observed every subtle exchange between his mother and the young man. The way she poured tea for him first, the way they communicated through glances more than words, and the way the music he played after dinner seemed meant for no one else but her. That night, when the house had fallen silent, Edward stepped out onto the porch and made a phone call to an old acquaintance in the credit management sector. He spoke just one sentence. I need information on a student named Lucas Bennett. Family, finances, anything you can find. On the other end, the man chuckled. You have doubts too? With that kind of age gap, usually it's, no, Edward cut him off. I don't need opinions. I need facts. And in Edward's mind, it wasn't just about protecting family assets. It was something more unsettling. For the first time, his mother, a woman always known for her rationality and composure, was smiling gently because of a man nearly 50 years her junior. Edward wasn't jealous. He was afraid. Afraid that his mother was believing in something he simply couldn't understand. That love could exist without ulterior motives. 2 days after that tense dinner, Edward sat in a quiet cafe downtown across from a man in a dark suit, carrying a worn leather briefcase, a credit analyst he had worked with on past financial assessments. The man placed a thin folder on the table and said simply, not much data, but enough for you to draw your own conclusions. Edward opened the file. Inside were old bank statements from the Bennett family, notices from a local bank regarding asset repossession, and a desperate letter from Lucas's mother pleading with the bank the previous year. Outstanding debt, over $80,000. Most of it came from a failed business loan taken out by Lucas's late father. Their former suburban home had already been seized. The family was now renting a low-cost apartment, surviving on community aid. Edward's eyes stopped at the final line of the report. Lucas Bennett currently sends between $250 to $400 monthly, transferred from his scholarship and part-time job earnings. He flipped through the pages again, this time reading more slowly. A strange tightness built in his chest. That quiet young man, the one with the steady demeanor, the gentle presence, the warm music, was carrying the weight of debt and struggling to hide it beneath a composed exterior. On his way home, Edward didn't call his mother right away. He drove aimlessly through old city streets, his thoughts tangled. On one hand, everything fit the typical warning signs he'd heard before. A struggling young man connects with a wealthy older woman, gains her trust, slowly becomes part of her private world. But on the other hand, Lucas had never asked for anything. He hadn't stayed overnight. He hadn't accepted expensive gifts. He hadn't shown arrogance or ambition. All he had ever done was play music. Finally, Edward made the call. Did you know he's in debt? Margaret's voice didn't hesitate for even a second. I did. And you don't think it's a problem that he never told you? Margaret paused briefly before answering. I think if Lucas had told you, you would never believe he cared for me beyond money. Edward was caught off guard. His mother had always been sharp-tongued, but she had never spoken with such quiet certainty before. What are you planning to do? He asked, almost without thinking. Margaret's voice was steady. Nothing. Then more softly, I believe that when someone hides their suffering, not to deceive, but to protect another person, that is someone worth respecting. Edward had no response. After that call, he didn't speak to anyone about it, but something unsettled him. Not anger, but conflict. He still didn't trust Lucas, but for the first time, he began to doubt himself. Was he really trying to protect his mother, or was he just trying to protect his sense of control? After her call with Edward, Margaret sat for a long time in her private study. She didn't turn on the main light. Only the soft glow of the desk lamp illuminated the old photograph in front of her. Herself and her late husband, hand in hand, standing in front of the first art gallery they had opened together in 1982. He had died because of something seemingly trivial, a small favor she had asked. Just a trip to the pharmacy, just a few pills for her headache. From the moment he was gone, Margaret had lived with the weight of being the person who had accidentally caused something permanent. She had never allowed anyone to love her since, and she had never allowed herself to open her heart again. Not until Lucas arrived. Not until he played the song she hadn't dared to hear for 10 years. Now she knew. He was carrying an entire broken family on his back. She knew he was hiding it not out of deceit, but out of fear. The fear of being misunderstood. And she understood that fear. She knew what it was like to dread pity more than poverty itself. The next day, Margaret arranged a private meeting with an old friend, a financial attorney who had helped her handle numerous charity cases over the years. She instructed him to transfer an amount exactly matching the outstanding debt of the Bennett family. "Don't tell anyone," Margaret said, "and don't let him know I had anything to do with it." The lawyer was surprised. "I thought you'd say he was a gold digger." Margaret simply smiled. If he were truly a gold digger, he wouldn't have hidden it. A week later, Lucas's mother received a call from the bank. The credit officer's voice was unfamiliar, yet exceptionally polite. "A special payment has been made toward your loan account. Your debt has been settled." "Congratulations," Lucas heard the news from his mother over the phone. He stood frozen in his dorm room, heart pounding. He knew no one in his family had the means to do this. And there was only one person who had once looked him in the eye and asked, "If you needed help, would you tell me?" That day, Lucas arrived at the villa as usual, but he brought a small gift, an old leather notebook filled with unfinished compositions he had never shared with anyone. "I want you to have this," he said, placing it on the tea table. "Not as a thank you, just because if it weren't for you, these pieces might never have existed." Margaret looked at him. "If one day you ever want to share your true sorrows, I'll be here. I won't ask anything. Just play for me." Lucas nodded. For the first time, he felt truly understood. Not through words, but through a trust so deep it didn't need questions. And in the soft glow of that room, something profound was exchanged. Not money, not charity, but a chance to move forward without the weight of debt or obligation. On an early April morning, the sky over Weston-super-Mare was crystal clear after a night of rain. The garden behind Margaret's house had been carefully arranged. Tulips and hydrangeas lined neatly. Simple wooden chairs set in 2 quiet rows. A lone violin played a soft melody in the background. It was the wedding day of Lucas and Margaret. No media, no extravagant gowns, no diamond rings. Just a few close friends, an elderly priest who had known Margaret's family for years, and 2 hands clasped tightly together, silent but unwavering. Lucas wore a simple light gray suit, his hair neatly combed, while Margaret wore a pale blue dress with a V neckline, holding a bouquet of white roses arranged by Lucas himself. No lengthy speeches were given. When the priest asked, "Do you promise to love and care for this person for the rest of your life?" Both answered yes, without a moment of hesitation. But the most important guest was not among those seated. Edward. He knew today was the wedding. His mother had texted him a week earlier, saying only, "You don't have to come, but I hope you understand, I'm choosing happiness." Edward hadn't replied, but that morning he was there, not inside, just outside the gate, sitting in his car, looking through the low wooden fence at his mother, the strong, composed woman he had always known. Now standing beside a young man, smiling like a girl in love for the first time. No one cried during the ceremony, but every pair of eyes glistened. After the wedding, Lucas and Margaret didn't go on a honeymoon. They simply strolled through town, had dinner at their usual fish and chip shop, the same place where Margaret had once said, "If you keep calling me ma'am, I'll never invite you for tea again." The entire evening, Lucas never let go of Margaret's hand, not out of fear, but because her hand was the only place he had ever felt truly safe. That night, when they returned to the villa, Margaret placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder and asked, "Do you feel like everything is okay?" Lucas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he led her to the center of the living room, where the organ still sat, and began playing a piece no one had ever heard before. The Quiet Vow. It would later become the opening piece in every performance of the community music program Lucas founded. But that night, it was for no one else, just the two of them. One who had lost everything and chose to believe again. One who had carried a lifetime of debt and chose to repay it with kindness and devotion. Outside, Edward still sat in his car, watching the lights glowing through the villa's windows. He wasn't angry, he wasn't opposed, but for the first time, a quiet question stirred in his heart. Could it be my mother was right? After the simple wedding, Lucas didn't change the way he lived. He still taught free music classes for underprivileged children at the local church every Tuesday and Thursday. He still rode his bicycle to campus, carrying the same worn-out backpack and the homemade lunch Margaret had packed for him. No one at school knew he had just married one of the wealthiest, most influential women in the region, and he never mentioned it. Margaret offered to help him open his own music academy. She was willing to fund a studio, buy equipment, even hire staff if needed. But Lucas gently refused. "If I start with your money, then any success I achieve will never truly be mine." Margaret wasn't upset. She simply looked at him with the soft gaze of someone who had lost her husband over a small, fateful mistake, and had now learned to respect every choice of the person she loved. Lucas graduated with honors. His composition, The Quiet Vow, was chosen as the opening piece for the Rebirth of Sound concert series, an initiative he organized to raise funds for families who had suffered bankruptcy. With nothing but an old piano, an emotional melody, and sincerity that resonated, Lucas slowly gained recognition. Not as an entertainer, but as someone who brought music that healed. With the modest earnings from his concerts and teaching, Lucas founded Loose Tone, a small company specializing in designing therapeutic sound environments for nursing homes and hospitals. The idea was met with overwhelming support. Before long, Loose Tone secured contracts with a prestigious rehabilitation center chain, and Lucas became a respected name in the field of music therapy, integrated with technology. A few years later, Lucas bought a small plot of land on the outskirts of the city and built a simple yet warm two-story home with a sunlit living room, an open kitchen, and a dedicated recording studio for his community projects. He brought Margaret to live there, leaving behind the grand villa, the place weighed down by old memories and the judgmental whispers of outsiders. They lived like any ordinary couple, shopping for groceries on weekends, growing vegetables in the backyard, and playing music together every night before bed. Margaret never asked how much he earned. Lucas never mentioned it. But one day she opened the fridge and noticed a box of her favorite Japanese rice, 3 times the price of regular rice. The living room had also been fitted with an expensive built-in speaker system, and when she asked, Lucas simply said, "So you can hear Chopin more clearly." She understood then he was succeeding, and more importantly, he had never spent a single cent of her money. One night, Margaret asked, "If one day I'm no longer here, what will you do?" Lucas simply replied, "I will keep living the way you believed in me from the beginning. No borrowing, no taking, only giving back." That answer made Margaret smile. Not the smile of a wife, but the smile of someone witnessing a boy she once knew, finally standing as a man. On a crisp autumn morning, Lucas woke up early, as always, and prepared ginger tea for Margaret. He planned to wake her for breakfast and share the new arrangement he had finished the night before. But when he stepped into the room, he froze. Margaret sat by the window, wrapped in her favorite cream-colored sweater, a book resting lightly in her lap, bathed in the soft morning sunlight. But she was motionless, no breath. Only a silence so beautiful, it was heartbreaking. Lucas didn't cry. He walked over, took her hand in his, and sat across from her. After a long moment, he pressed play on the Quiet Vow recording. Through the very sound system he had designed specifically for this room, The melody filled the space, wrapping around them like a farewell, a final tribute from his heart to the one who had given him a new life. The funeral was held 3 days later. No grand ceremonies, no media, no elaborate goodbyes. Just a small group of close friends, a piece of music played by Lucas himself, and Margaret's framed photograph, smiling gently, as if there had never been a farewell at all. Edward returned from New York for the service. He wore a black suit, his face cold and unreadable, sitting in the front row without speaking to anyone. After the ceremony, he shook Lucas's hand, brief and mechanical. "I'm grateful that you were with my mother in her final years." That was all he said. 3 days later, Edward was at his mother's lawyer's office to discuss the estate. He came prepared for confrontation, expecting complications, expecting to argue. But what awaited him was nothing like what he had anticipated. The family attorney opened the will and read it slowly. "Mrs. Margaret Harrington has left her entire estate, including the villa, the art galleries, all investments, and trust funds, to her biological son, Edward Harrington." Edward was stunned. "Nothing for Lucas?" The lawyer shook his head. "Number, he declined any inheritance. However, there is a separate file that Mrs. Harrington instructed me to give you personally." Edward opened the folder. Inside were bank statements, spanning 6 years. Line by line, every transaction was clear. Lucas Bennett had been repaying every cent of the money Margaret had secretly used to save his family from financial ruin. Bit by bit, month by month. Some payments were a few $100s, others over $1,000. All transferred from an account under Loose Tone, the therapeutic music company now recognized nationally for its work in rehabilitation centers. The memo on every transaction was identical: repaying a debt of trust, no interest, never forgotten. Edward went still. He recalled seeing a short article about Loose Tone once, about a humanitarian sound therapy company founded by a young musician who believes in healing through the very thing that once saved him. He never realized the founder was Lucas, the same man he had once looked down on, the same man he had suspected of being a gold digger, the same man he had feared would threaten his mother's fortune. Not a single word of self-praise, not a single attempt to reclaim honor. Just 6 years of quiet, unwavering action, like a long, unspoken thank you, filled with dignity. Edward closed the file, his hands still trembling. His heart felt empty, not out of fear of losing, but because he realized he had already lost something far greater than wealth. His mother's trust and the kindness of a man he once looked down on. A week after finalizing all matters related to his mother, Edward unexpectedly arrived at Loose Tone's headquarters. No appointment. He simply stepped into the small glass building nestled beside the city park, where a wooden sign read, "Healing sounds come from places once wounded." Inside, a little girl was playing the piano, while a technician adjusted the sound. Nearby, an elderly woman beamed as she tested a pair of therapeutic headphones. Edward froze. This place was unlike any company he had ever known. Within minutes, Lucas appeared. White dress shirt, light gray coat, a calm, steady gaze. The young student from years ago had become a composed, self-assured man. Edward stepped forward and extended his hand. They shook, firm, without excess display. "Thank you for giving everything back. And more than that," Edward said. Lucas remained silent, his expression tranquil. "I once thought you were after money. I investigated, I doubted. I even hoped you'd make a mistake just so I could prove myself right," Edward admitted. "But you never took anything. You returned every cent." Lucas gave a small shrug. "Because that wasn't money I wanted to keep. It was a debt of trust." After a moment of quiet, Edward placed a thick envelope on the table. "Your share of the inheritance. I know you don't need it, but this is out of respect." Lucas gently pushed it back. "Thank you, but I already have enough." They shook hands again, this time firmer, not as rivals, but as two men who had finally understood something important. Edward hesitated, then spoke softly. "My mother once said, you were the most beautiful surprise of her life." Lucas smiled. "And she was the greatest gift of mine." After that meeting, Edward never returned to Lucestone. He went back to New York, back to his fast-paced world of contracts and numbers. But in a private drawer in his office, he kept one file: the bank statements showing how Lucas had quietly repaid every dollar his mother had once given to save his family. Not to track him, but to remind himself. True kindness doesn't seek recognition, but it always leaves a trace. Lucas continued leading Lucestone, his company of healing sounds. There were no photos of him on the website, no media stories, only a single quote. "Someone once believed in me, not because I had succeeded, but because they believed I would become a good person." The house where Lucas and Margaret once lived was now a community music center called Margaret House. Disabled children learned music there for free. Elderly visitors came to listen to live piano performances every week. At the center of the room stood an old organ with a small plaque beside it: "Love needs no will." One day, Edward visited Margaret House, unannounced. He didn't step inside. He simply stood outside the fence, watching a little girl laughing as she played an instrument for the first time. She didn't know who Margaret was, but the music she was receiving came from a love his mother had once been brave enough to hold on to, despite the judgment of the world. At that moment, Edward finally understood. The greatest legacy his mother left behind wasn't wealth. It was the ability to see goodness in others before they had even proven themselves.